Forget. Record. How are you guys doing tonight?
Pretty good.
Yeah, good.
Good. Just got back from our last T-ball game of the season.
Oh, yay.
Last T-ball game ever.
They move up to
My middle one moves up to coach pitch, but my youngest, my daughter, she's not interested enough. We're not gonna. It's just not working.
my poor kids had no choice. Whenever they were little, I said, I've got 4 kids on 4 teams. Everybody is playing soccer because I can only be at one field at a time. So my youngest one wanted to play football forever. He didn't get to play until he was in 5th grade because I was like, I cannot do.
Yeah.
So the older kids could drive. Yeah. So, all right. So, first of all, I'm behind on getting your stuff graded into you. I will get that right back to you as soon as I possibly can. I started looking through it. I've read through a bunch of the first set of questions where you were looking at the 5 different pieces and then putting them together into different ones. And I didn't have it in the grade book at the time. I was doing it in a separate file. So I just have not gotten that transferred over. I'm looking at your research questions now. I'm going to try and get that back to you first because I think it'll be more beneficial for you to have that to you first before the other. This past week, you were working on a literature review. And I know a lot of you are still, it's only draft. This was not supposed to be the end-all, be-all finished product. It's just kind of getting it started. So as I told a couple of you when we were talking individually, with the literature review, your whole paper should look like an hourglass. Okay, you're starting with your big idea and then, narrowing it. So maybe I'm going to look at computational thinking in a science classroom with middle school kids. Okay, so then I want to look at computational thinking as a whole, or why we want computational thinking. What is the educational push for it? The initiatives that are bringing it in. Why is it important? Because we want people to read. And then we go into a little narrower band and we start narrowing it down our focus. And this is what it's talking about the theoretical framework. Your literature review, a literature review is typically pretty broad. It covers all your topics. A theoretical framework is going to narrow it down to the pieces that you're actually thinking or drawing upon. So if I were looking at how using coding activities with robotics in my middle school science classroom, I'm going to look at it from a big, broad framework of, science education as a whole, then maybe how computational thinking fits into this, and then how robotics and coding can help build these skills. And then I narrow it into the tiny area that I am interested in looking at. And that's where, you've funneled it down to there. And then that's where your research question falls. So, this is the big area, smaller area, smaller area. Here's the problem. This is why my study is important. And then you start broadening it back out because you're going to be looking at, here are my research questions and here are the methods I'm going to use. Here's the data I'm collecting and here's my big findings at the end. And your whole paper kind of looks like an hourglass then as you're working through it. So as you're working on your literature review or your theoretical framework, I don't care if there have been 117 articles on computational thinking across the end-all and be-all of every subject. I am looking at very specifically, the foundation pieces that everybody cites, and I am looking at specifically the pieces that I am drawing from to base my study on it. So it might be something that is on computational thinking in English class, or maybe it's on science education and technology supporting that, but not on computational thinking. So these are the pieces that I'm going to bring into my theoretical framework or my literature review to say, this is what my study is, this is how I'm situating it. Here are how these pieces are, here are how my pieces are coming around. Here's science education, computational thinking, coding, and then this is where my study is going to actually reside. And so it's setting the stage for what you're going to do. So as you're working on your literature review, that's kind of what you're trying to think about doing, is laying it out in a logical framework that says, here's the big piece, here's the next piece, here's the next piece. This is why my study is important. Okay, because it fits these little, it fits in this niche where nobody else has done this work or where other people have done this work, but with other populations. And that kind of situates your study as being relevant to all these other areas, and kind of gives you the oomph that people are like, oh yeah, we need to publish that because people need to know about that. Okay, so that's kind of where you're at with the piece that was last week, was the drafting with that. Any questions from you on that right now? And honestly, don't think it has to be a finished product. Like when it says draft, I am really fine with really drafty. Like 3 sentences probably isn't enough to bother submitting, but if you have a couple topics and a sentence or 2 per topic, and you want to have an idea on whether your idea progression of ideas is following, being able to be followed, that's fine. It's just to kind of make sure that you have something to start building from. Doesn't have to be perfect. Always a work in progress. The only points you get right now, clear up to the end, are really just gold star points for turning stuff in, because getting all those zeros across was demoralizing, I was told. So, because everything used to be worth 0 points until the end. All right. So if there's no questions on that, the next thing that we're looking at this week is coming up with an observation guide, an interview protocol, and a data collection table. Now, in order to do those, though, you have to actually think through the design of your study, what you're actually going to do, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it. And that's where going back to that focusing activity, which I'll get back to you within the next 2 days. That focusing activity is really important for you because...
For you guys? Okay, you froze.
You froze on us.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, I didn't know I froze. I could see all of you, and it looked like you were still moving, so maybe it was just me. Okay. Design of your study. So what you want to be looking at is how the literature that you're looking at from your literature review and your theoretical framework kind of informs the questions that you're asking and the data that you're going to be collecting. So when you're thinking about your research questions, which all of you talked about whenever we were doing the kind of personal one-on-one time, we talked about research questions, where you wanted to go, areas you wanted to investigate. So when you're looking at that, you want to really make sure that your data allows you to answer that. And I do realize that with some of you, finding a document to analyze is really a stretch. Or for some of you, an observation is really, we're going to find, we're finding some digital way to stretch it so that you can do this. Because for this project, for this class, I'm being picky, you have to have the 3 kinds of data. Whereas normally you would have only the data that really answers your question. Okay, so as you're building your design of your study, sometimes all you're doing is looking at people's perceptions on something that they've done. So they're doing something already, you're watching them do it, and you're going to interview them at the end and talk to them at the end. So there are some design pieces to consider, when you interview them, how you interview, how you're talking to them, small group or large group, what kind of observation you're going to do, but that really doesn't affect them. They're doing their class, they're doing their work, whatever it is, and you're observing them as they're going along. All right, and you're just talking to them at the end. So the design for that feels kind of almost unnecessary because from my experience, because it feels like you're just kind of looking at what's going on and asking them questions at the end. But what you want to do with this is really carefully think through, where do you need to ask them the questions? Do you need to talk to them before they have this experience so that you can understand their perceptions before it? Do you need to talk to them afterwards? And how would you ask your questions then? Thinking back to the beginning, maybe you're using a retrospective perspective, which is a mouthful, where you're at the end and you're saying, think about the beginning and how you felt then, or what your understanding was then, or how your skills were at that point, and having them think back. And that's also a valid way to do that. So for some of you, what you're thinking about for your dissertation work is actually more of a designed study, where you're deliberately putting people in a situation for them to do some things so that you can get some data to answer your questions at the end. Okay, so if that's the case that you're looking at it, then you're looking at needing a little bit more of a specific kind of design, a specific kind of intervention or setting where you're having them do these things, talk through these things, experience different tools or ways to do things, different types of professional development, different kind of experiences. And in that case, you need to think carefully through all of the steps to make sure that they're getting the experiences that you have them doing, you need them to do in order to answer your questions, and that you're going to be able to actually get the data at the end. Okay. So with that, for this week, the observation guide is simply within the Spradley book on page, I think 78, they have a list of 9 little topics. That's the guide. And Robert, thank you very much. I fixed the link. I don't know what it was. The one link was working, the other one with what it should have been at the first one. And the second one, I don't know, it had, one of them was wrong. So there's a Spradley book dropped in there. You have the PDF of the entire book. It's a really great book. Anytime you want to do any kind of observation, any kind of ethnography, they really walk you through a lot of different protocols and different pieces. You're looking specifically at chapter 3 and part 4, step 4. You can skim the entire chapter, and I've given you some page numbers for the second one especially to look very specifically at just one little paragraph where it lists 9 things. So for your observation, you want to look very carefully at those 9 dimensions, they call it, and make sure that your observation, any data that you need that falls into any of those 9 dimensions, that you're able to capture. Are you going to use all 9? No. Do you need to consider all 9? Yes. So with it, you're kind of looking at these 9 pieces, like, you know, what does the environment look like? Who are the actors? Which means, like, who are you observing? Who are you talking about? What kind of things are you going to look for, and what kind of things are you going to ignore? Because there will be definitely pieces, if you're observing, especially within a large group situation or something like that, there's going to be things you don't even care about. They don't answer your questions. You may capture them if you have video, but if you have 6 hours of video to watch for something, you're not going to be able to record and identify and write down things that are happening across every single second of every single person's actions on it. You need to be able to focus on what you need to capture, and that's what the observation guide allows you to do. It gives you a structure for the important things for you, and you can always note if there's extra things that are interesting. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. I was thinking about it, like if you went to a concert and you're scanning the concert for like people that are misbehaving. You have all your kids, with you, either it's from your school or with your kids, or a classroom of people, or a tour bus full of people that you're responsible for, and you're kind of watching the whole situation, seeing what's all going on, making sure everybody's okay. And so, there's things that you're looking for that. You don't really care that, the 80-year-old person over here is going crazy and waving a real lighter or something instead of their cell phone lighter at the concert or whatever. You're interested in the people that are over here that you're responsible for. So it's kind of like that. It's a divided focus where you'll notice there's other pieces going on perhaps, and maybe they're really interesting, but you have a focused set of things that you need to get your data, that you have to plan out what you're going to be capturing ahead of time, or else you end up really with a big kind of garbled mess. Questions? No. Okay. The interview protocol. Yeah, Sarah.
You're about to talk about it, so I'll wait. I was going to ask about the interview stuff.
The interview protocol, I think I've already seen yours, correct? Yeah.
Can we do group?
You can. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as you sit down to start thinking through your interview pieces, you need to figure out what data, again, what is going to answer your questions. Do you want to talk to people one-on-one? Do they have personal experiences that you think will be kind of squashed if you're talking about it in a group? The dynamics of the people that you're working with even. Do you have somebody who tends to override every conversation? Or do you have a lot of quiet people that won't talk if they're in front of people? So those kind of things can lead you to asking individual versus group, looking at individual versus group settings. Sometimes it is simply the time that you have allotted. You want to talk to 6 people, you have 1 hour that they're giving you. That's all you have. So you're going to do a group one then, and you're going to make it work, because that's the kind of parameters that you don't have any influence over or any way to work around. So sometimes even the time constraints in the place you're working with, those kind of things can kind of demand that you do certain types of protocols while you're working with it. You always hope for the best case scenario where you get to say, I really want to do 5 individual interviews and then I want to talk to them all as a group. Or maybe, you don't need that. You only want the individual interviews. So group dynamics, you have to really be careful whenever you're structuring it that you have a kind of a thought process in place, that if you have someone who is dominating the conversation, that you can bring other people's voices into it. And you also want to be really careful that you don't have a group that's going to take it off and take it in a direction you didn't want it to go, and not get you back to the questions that you need answered to answer your research question. That's why having a protocol in place before you go in is really helpful. Think about it as like trying to talk to a 3-year-old. You need to know where they hid your car keys. You need to find this out, and they don't really want to talk to you about it. So you're looking at ways to ask them questions to get to the answer, in a way that you're not necessarily asking them directly, because you won't get any answer at all then. So you want to a lot of times offer very open-ended questions. Think about it like a newspaper article when you're in 5th grade and they tell you the who, what, when, where, why, how. Asking questions like that don't have a yes or no answer, a lot of times can help people get started talking. Asking them questions where you ask them to tell you about something, describe something to you. These kind of things can give you a lot of information that you weren't necessarily considering, and give you a lot of background information that may help you make your case, build your arguments, provide evidence for things or ways that you can take your research in the future. So one of the best questions I had with high school kids, 10th graders, was, so tell me what you think I should do better the next time. Okay, when we ran this project that I was working on for my dissertation, what kind of things do you think I should do if I do this again? And they were very open about the things that they thought worked really well and the things that they didn't think worked very well. Hi, I'm freezing, I guess. Am I back? I don't know what's going on with my internet tonight. Sorry. Not even storming. It's been storming for 3 days and it hasn't been a problem. Yeah, just keep telling me whenever. I don't know what I can do about it, but thank you. I appreciate your bearing with me. And so asking them, how you could better the experience for someone else. If you're looking for perceptions and you're looking for, design principles that you think could be imperative to like your next iteration of what you're working with or something like that. Asking them for their experiences. What was the best one that they've ever, best PD that they've ever been to? How do you find resources for your classroom? What kind of online materials do you look for? How do you find where do you go whenever you're looking for information about chess? Any of these kind of pieces where you can get them talking about their own experience and kind of guide it helps a lot. Other questions you have about interviewing?
Can I say something real quick?
Sure.
So it's not about interviewing, but it's about the whole process. I feel like the qualitative design that we have kind of idea is a lot like just mixed methods. I mean, because we're doing the interview and then we have to support it with the documents and the observation kind of thing. So it's like taking the questions and the letting them kind of and trying to get the more abstract thoughts and then supporting it with hard data a little bit more. So it almost feels like it's got a little like it's like a miniature mixed methods kind of idea. Like you don't have a whole huge second part, but you do have a little bit of numbers in there to help back it up a little bit. The kind of idea, or
no, not necessarily, because well, it is. You're right. You're supporting it with the different pieces, so I can see how you feel like it aligns to that. If you're doing a purely qualitative piece with different pieces of documentation, for example, I'm looking at how students are using 3D pens and how it's impacting their creativity and their engagement with the science lesson. Okay, so one of my research questions for this is, do the students feel, but is their perception of the pen allowing them, am I frozen again? No, okay. Sorry, it just broke. Is their perception of the pen as something that's any different? Are they seeing any difference themselves between having a regular pen and having the 3-dimensional pen when they're drawing it? Because it's just a build-a-bug activity with a biome. You can do it with a pencil. And So the students, one of the things that a student said was that they think that the pen is different than a pencil because there's not an eraser, that you have to keep going. You have to figure out a way to make it work. Whereas with a pencil, you could crunch up your paper and throw it away, or you could just erase it and start again. So I'll use that interview, like an excerpt from that interview. I'll quote the student from what they said there. And then what I'll also do is the students are writing like a written reflection response at the end of it. And one of them has gone in there and they said that using the pen was the best lesson ever, that it allowed them to experience some things that they never thought they could do in a regular elementary classroom, from a fifth grader. And I was like, okay, so that's a really good quote too. So I'll pull that out of her document, her written document, and I'll use that as well. I really don't know, like observationally, we probably have some things that we'll pull out we have not gone through the video any more than that though. So we're layering those pieces. Now, what you're talking—
I wasn't thinking about it that way. I was thinking about it more of coming up with the ideas from the interviews and then supporting it with the documents and the data or the documents and the observations that I was making. I wasn't thinking out of it as much as having information from each of those three. I was just thinking of it more of interviews. Here's what they said, and this is how it kind of corroborates everything that they're saying. But it's a little bit different what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, but that'll work too. That does work too. I think I'm following, knowing what you're doing. I think I'm following what you're saying, because you can also do it as if you were watching them do an internet search, for example, and you were looking at their search history, okay, to see where they're looking for their OER resources, and they tell you that this is what they do, but then they actually pull up their search history and they give it to you, and you're like, that's not what you're doing. You're actually going here, and then you're really, you're linking to that one and linking to this one and linking to this one. You're not using the database really at all. You're just, finding an article on Google and going there, and then you're like tracking back through the references or the related links or something like that. So that would be a document. You could have a screenshot of it, and you could actually like look at that and use that as a piece of evidence. As you can see in this screenshot, the student's search history does not support what they actually said. This is what their actual process is. And that would be considered qualitative research. But what I think you're talking about, what I think you were intending at first, was actually quantifying qualitative data, where maybe a little bit, where you would go in and I would say that in this video, the kid said, wow, 17 times. I'm coding it for excitement. I'm coding it for exuberance. I'm coding it for engagement. And there, in this class of, in 15 minutes of video, the student was engaged all 15 minutes and they said, wow, or, exclamations of excitement 13 times. Whereas when they're doing it with the pencil, they didn't say anything at all. And I can look at that, and that quantifying qualitative data is a way that you can support your qualitative data in a kind of numbery way, but it still fits into the paradigm of qualitative data most of the time. Now, if you take your codes and you run a statistical analysis on it and use that as two pieces of your study to work together with it, then you're looking at more of a mixed methods, what they would consider. So
thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. That was a good question. You guys always have good questions. Anybody else have a question about it? Okay, the third piece that you need is just a data collection table. And with that one, all we're looking at, I think I gave you an example in there, but all we're looking at with the data collection table is, if I'm going to have these observations, these are the questions that it will answer. And this is how, you're just setting it up to make sure that you're kind of covering all your bases. It goes along with your design. So if you have them doing this activity in class and you are videoing it this entire time, these are the pieces that I feel I'm going to be able to pull out of this. It's kind of like a double check on yourself, so that whenever you come back in, you're not going afterwards and being like, oh, I should have really done it that way because I didn't get what I needed, which I've been there and done that. And that kind of stinks because you can never go back to the same situation. And if you don't have it the first time, it's gone. The other question was, somebody had emailed and asked me, and I think I emailed them back and answered it, but just in case I hadn't, you do not have to videotape all of your interviews. You can even write them out longhand, but I don't suggest it. If you're writing out your answers, it's really hard to catch it verbatim, and it's really hard to be like present with the person while you're writing everything down. It is fine to audio record. You do not necessarily need a video. Think about the data that you need. If you just need them to talk to you and you need their words, then recording it with an audio recorder is fine. If you want to see what they're doing, if they're, showing you things on their phone and they're pointing at things on the screen, or they're gesturing and it might be something important, then having it as a video is a lot more helpful. If you're doing group work, it helps also to have everyone give their name at the beginning so you can hear their voice if you're only capturing it on audio. Because then you can kind of match up the voices. If you forget who said what, it gives you a little bit of a help with identifying the people that you're talking to if you don't have video to see them kind of, talking to you.
If we do audio with field notes, is that okay?
And do just a recording as you're working with that?
Yeah, like I recorded the audio and then I did like a diagram of the table and like
Mm-hmm.
SP 1, 2, 3, 4 and said SP4.
Yeah.
Okay.
That helps. A field note can actually also capture things that you didn't get on video. Like we were talking about health and genetic predispositions with a group of students, and I was back checking the battery on the camera, and a little girl walked back to me and she said, my sister has PKU and I should have had PKU too, but I don't have it. And she was saying like, it's in, my mom has the carrier, my mom is a carrier, my dad is a carrier. And she was going into this whole description of it and how it affects her sister and all these different things. And I don't have her on camera. So what I am allowed to do though, as a qualitative, as a researcher, is I can write up a field note of that. So as soon as the kids were out of the classroom, I was writing down every detail that I could remember about it. I cannot quote her directly. So whenever I'm putting it in, I can only paraphrase and say, this student talked about this, or this student, discussed this with me. Or, I can't actually quote it unless I can remember word for word what she said, which sometimes you're lucky enough to be able to capture that real quickly afterwards. But those are what field notes are for too, as well, to write those kind of things down. Or if you're watching, for example, with you, Sarah, if you're watching them doing their whole working with the patient, you're watching that for 15 minutes or half an hour or something like that, and you notice that at minute 10 they're really doing something interesting, you can jot that down, and as you're writing it up you can say, this person did this, I want to remember to ask them this later, or this happened in there, I think that this could mean that. You're allowed to do some interpretation in your field notes as you're going through, kind of just to keep a running total in your head of what's going on. Because otherwise, sometimes it happens and it's lost if you don't write it down. But yeah, you can use an audio recorder for that if you have one, especially. That's really nice. Other questions about this? Okay. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to get your research questions back to you, and I will get your, as soon as you get me your observation protocols and those kind of things back to you, get them to me. I will get them back to you as soon as I can with that, hopefully by Wednesday next week. For those of you that are working ahead because of time constraints, I'm going to try and get those back to you in the next 3 days. That a couple people have turned me in things ahead of time because of that, if I haven't gotten them back to you yet. Before you start working with people, I do want to talk to you about it and make sure that everything looks like it's in line and in place, unless we already discussed the time frame and that kind of thing before. Because I know because of the time constraints with Sarah, she had to get really kind of started now. So she's kind of flopping some pieces around. But if any of the other of you have time constraints with the population that you're working with, you need to get a hold of them before they leave on vacation or something like that, then talk to me about getting some pieces put together so you have a chance to collect your data and work with it, and you can always finish up your lit review in another week or two. Yeah. Okay. So what's the biggest problem you're seeing so far with everything you've been working on?
Finding time.
Yeah, qualitative research is not Yeah, it's time consuming and it's summer.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely not as clear cut as the quantitative analysis. I think that's actually, for me, it seems to be easier. And we start looking at the qualitative stuff, you're like, oh my God, I got to sit here and interview folks and do observations and all these things where I can just do a survey if I'm doing quantitative, right? It's super easy. Let's just do a survey, send it on out, see what we get.
I will tell you that there are some people who do not believe that survey research is worthy of a dissertation. I'm not saying that's here, but I do know that there are some people who don't feel that.
No, Todd was telling me the same thing.
Yeah. No. If you're making room,
I'm going to be doing it.
hey, I understand. I've done survey work before too. I know the whole factor analysis, structural equation modeling. Been there, done that. What I like about qualitative data, though, is it gives you so much of the detail with it. It just seems to make a richer, more full picture than the quantitative work that I've done. So I do both, and I get mixed methods stuck in the middle too. So
I like mixed methods. Yeah.
I love saying this is what I think it is, yes or no, and why. That's always really a nice place to be. Okay.
Yeah, I'm having kind of the same problem. I'm very comfortable with quantitative and just knowing what I need to do and how to organize it is what I know what goes in a quantitative paper. I don't know what goes in a qualitative paper as well, and how it's done, because they're definitely organized differently, and they get a lot more. There's a lot more in the lit review, a lot more explanation. There's a lot more with certain parts, and then a lot less in other parts, and I'm just not comfortable with that yet. So
yeah. Well, I will tell you that you probably won't be comfortable with it until you've done it. And then you're still not going to be comfortable with it, but it'll be a little easier. I will say that I have a friend who had like 40 papers out in 5 years. And I was like, how do you manage that? He's like, I do all quantitative studies. He said, there's a formula to it. You set it up, you do this, this, and this. It's pretty easy. So I will say that not all the time there is quantitative work that is very difficult. There's a lot of advanced quantitative analyses that you can work with that you really have to think through all of your constraints, and you really have to know your stuff with the quantitative pieces, or you can get nailed by people reviewing you because they know their stuff really well. The qualitative stuff seems to take a lot longer to work through and piece through. It takes longer to analyze. Not a problem. It takes longer to analyze. It takes longer to work through it sometimes, but you can get some really rich results. And there are just some questions that you cannot answer quantitatively. And I do apologize that I really can't say this is exactly what it's going to look like, because none of you are doing the same thing. My life would be a whole lot easier if I said, this is what you're going to do, and this is how you're going to do it, but it's not going to help you out at all. And as you're going forward, email me. We can talk anytime you need to talk. I mean, we can work through pieces that you have questions on and try and help you see how things fit together. So the next time that we talk next week, when we talk next week, I would like to be able to run through the basics of starting to look at how you're going to analyze your data, and showing you some software tools that I use to analyze qualitative data, so that you have tools to play with before you have to start working with them. So, any other questions that you guys have? Yeah? Okay. I won't make you stick around any longer then if you don't have any questions. That gives you lots more time to work on your lit review.
It's crickets on this end.
Yeah, it is. And you guys are usually talkers. So
I just don't know. I don't know what to ask yet. So, I think once we get back a little bit more feedback,
yes.
from that stuff, that I'll have a lot more questions for you. I'm just at that spot where I'm like, you'll see my submission. I submitted it, and I'm like, I don't know what the fuck. I'm like, I don't know. I wrote in there. I'm like, I got something in there. I got a general idea, but I don't know how much depth to go into. I don't know.
Okay.
I think I'm taking like a quantitative idea and like melding it with a qualitative kind of question. I'm having a problem. Like in a lot of the other papers, they're like, we did all this and this and this, and I'm like, I asked them some questions, and then I look for some other stuff. There's not a whole lot of complexity to the particular topic that I think I'm at the moment. So I've looked at a whole bunch of different papers, and when I wrote my methods, I was like, oh, this is like it was like a page, and I'm like, oh,
that's okay. That's all right.
We'll see. So I think once we get some feedback, you'll probably have a lot more questions.
I do apologize because my son graduated and then we had his graduation party, and like I feel like
I missed my meeting earlier today with my group. Apologize, group. I'm sorry. I had family stuff. Anyways,
Yes, exactly.
So the Cresswell book that we used last term in the quantitative class, it has a chapter. I think it's chapter 3, talking about the difference between the lit review and the quantitative versus the qualitative. And essentially what I took from that was that the lit review in the qualitative at the beginning of your research paper was very light, okay? And that the lit review at the end of your paper in a qualitative was much more in-depth.
No.
That's not the way you see it.
No, the way I see it is you have to set up your framework at the beginning. And I'm going to lose you guys. You'll have to hop back in if you want to talk. Whenever you're looking at your literature review with the beginning, you're going to be setting up your framework for what you're using. That's the pieces right before you hopped in, it starts pretty broad and it narrows down. So here's how the entire world sees this subject. Here's how this group that I'm focusing on sees it. Here's how I'm looking at it. It kind of narrows down to your research questions. That can take 10 pages.
And that's
3 pages. And I either froze or else it's kicking everybody off.
Are we starting to get cut out here?
No, I don't know. Mine's been kicking me off all night, or freezing me all night.
Okay, so